So late last year, the folks at Epic Games released a tech demo of their new Unreal Engine 5. And while the video was impressive, I couldn't help but think, do you really need Unreal to make impressive games like this? I mean, could someone like me make something technically impressive in any other game engine like, say, Unity? Well, to find out, I'm giving myself a challenge. My goal is to try to make a complete commercial game within a year with realistic or semi-realistic graphics that is considered to be technically impressive. And before we can do any of this, we need a game idea. Now, I always wanted to make an FPS game, but we're going to need a couple of interesting things to sell our game. So here's the idea. I want to make an FPS game based on the Spanish-American War. Now, for those of you who failed American history class, let me explain what the Spanish-American War was. It was basically a really short war in 1898 that lasted about a year. It was basically a war between Spain and America over the rights and independence of both the Philippines and Cuban islands. This war featured many famous land battles as well as a couple of naval battles as well, which I want to replicate in the game. Now, I want to take inspiration from another game made in Unity called Ravenfield. Ravenfield is an FPS game that is very open-ended. It features these very open-ended, non-linear battles where when a player dies, you don't necessarily lose the match, you just sort of respawn and continue the battle. And you lose when your whole army starts losing its resources or when you run out of soldiers to play as or things like that. So it gets rid of this whole like heroic sort of linear thing that you see in a lot of other FPS games. And I want to try to replicate that into this game as well. That isn't the only inspiration I'm looking for. The other inspiration I'm going to be taking from is from an old game called Battlefield 2. Now, in Battlefield 2, there was a mechanic called hot swapping, which was basically when you could play as any soldier at any time. If you wanted to play as a pilot or as someone in a land vehicle, you could. That also meant that when you died, you didn't have to reset as the same soldier. You could instead continue the battle as a different soldier. And this is another thing I could add to my game. So I kind of want to add this like soldier mechanic where each soldier has like a different gun loadout, and when the player dies, they can just play as a different soldier. And the losing state of the game is not when the player dies, but it's actually when the player runs out of other soldiers to play as. Going back to Ravenfield, there's one more key element I want to take inspiration from, and that is the squad control mechanic. Essentially, you could control multiple soldiers with simple commands that the player can give. And I kind of want to expand on this with sort of this like troop control system where you can have commanding officers that you can play as that can give really simple commands to these whole like troops or regiments of soldiers. So that kind of turns this FPS game into now sort of almost a strategy game as well. So to summarize, I want to make an FPS game based on the Spanish-American War featuring both land and naval battles. I want to have non-linear, open-ended battles that features this soldier swapping mechanic allowing players to play as any soldier with different gun loadouts, and the losing state of the game is when the player runs out of soldiers to play as. There will also be this troop control system allowing players to give very basic commands to troops of soldiers, turning this game into sort of a mix between an FPS game and a strategy game. Right, with the idea now set in place, there's one last thing we need to get into before we can start making ground, and that is the stages of development. I'm going to be splitting the development of this game into 4 different stages. The first stage is the main coding stage. This is where we're going to be making all of the gameplay features and all of the mechanics. The game is going to look like hot garbage during this stage, so if it looks pretty crappy, don't worry, it'll look better. Stage 2 is the asset creation stage. This is where we're actually be making all the models and animations. This is where the game is actually going to start looking like a game. There'll still be some coding here, but it's mostly going to be just expanding on things that were already made in stage 1. By the end of stage 2, I hope to have at least 1 or 2 levels that are fully playable and look close to the final game. Stage 3 is like stage 2, but it's basically where we're going to expand development and make all these different levels and turn a really short 1 to 2 level game into something that's fully complete. Finally, in stage 4, we're going to be polishing and testing the game to make sure there's almost no bugs or any glitches, and of course we'll be advertising and finally releasing the game. And with that out of the way, it's time to start making this game. So the first thing I did was make a brand new project using the latest version of Unity. I created a temporary terrain for the player to walk on and made a player object. Since I've never made a game like this before, I followed a tutorial by Brackeys on how to make the player move around with the arrow keys and look around with the mouse. After working on the code a little more, I finally had a decent player movement system and was ready to begin the next task. To give the player the ability to shoot weapons, I made this really simple temporary gun model and attached it to the player's view. Then, I used raycasts to simulate bullets coming out from the gun when the player fires. At this point, it only shows the name of the objects it hits. So, I added some more code, and now the player can shoot at enemies, which can take damage. I also added a temporary ammo count, but it's counting it pretty awkwardly. I also created a simple to-do list of features I need to work on while making the game. On the next day, I adjusted the code again to show the amount of ammo the player has more correctly, and I even gave the player the ability to switch weapons with different rates of fire. But by far the most notable thing I added that day was an early version of the soldier switching mechanic. At any time, the player simply presses a key on the keyboard, and you get this overhead view that allows you to pick which soldier you want to play as. Each soldier has their own weapons and individual ammo counts. In addition, I also simulated soldier health. So now soldiers can be played at varying health levels and can even injure each other if they want to. The following day I began the hardest challenge yet, programming some sort of AI system. Since I also never done this before, I followed a tutorial by CodeMonkey on Unity's pre-built navmesh system, which is a great way to simulate AI. This blue area shows where the AI can walk. And as you can see, it's a pretty smart system, even finding slopes that are too steep to be walked on. After spending some time tinkering around, I was ready to test the AI system. At this point, the soldiers simply wander around, but when the player switches to one of them, the AI on that soldier is turned off, and the player can control them as usual. When switching to another soldier, the AI system for the previous soldier is turned back on. I also made it so that when a soldier's health is critically low, they will despawn. Of course, this isn't final, it's just a temporary way to simulate death. Trying this out with a few soldiers was fun, but I wanted to take it to the next level, so I created an army of over 50 soldiers. This was really fun to play around with, especially with the soldier switching mechanic. More importantly, I was surprised at how well it ran. But having soldiers wander aimlessly isn't entirely what we're going for, so I tried making soldiers follow an enemy when they see one. First, I gave the soldiers some glasses to make it easier for me to see which direction they are facing, and created a system that checks for enemies around the soldier's area and forces the soldier to follow an enemy when they see one. Finally, I gave them the ability to shoot at a soldier, though it is currently only displayed through debugging text. The system is by no means final, but it's a good foundation to build the AI upon. With each day, the to-do list for my game gets more and more longer and complicated. And as mentioned before, the game really is far from over, but it has been so rewarding seeing the progress I've made in such a short amount of time. Anyway, I'll be leaving a link for the tutorial videos I followed in the description below. If you liked the video, hit the like button and subscribe to be up to date on new content related to the game's development. And until next time, see you in the next video.